Well, I'd like to welcome Kim Hamilton-Duffy. Kim's the executive director of the Distributed Identity Foundation. She's a board member for the Accountable Digital Identity Association and also the architecture advisor at Arizona State University's Trusted Learner Network, which sounds really interesting. I think you're also a member of the technology committee at MOSIP, if I'm saying that correctly.
That's right. Yeah. As
Great.
far as I know, that's how we say
I wasn't sure
it.
if that was supposed to be letters or if it was a name. So anyway,
Right.
welcome. I'm really excited to explore some of the challenges and possibilities in this domain of digital identity. It's been a fun exploration so far, and excited to hear about you and your
Thank
journey.
you.
So why
Thank
don't
you for having me. Yeah.
yeah, it's a pleasure. So why don't we start with your journey, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you got started in this field. It's a very interesting place to be in this day and age, and I'm really curious.
Yeah. So my background is, well, my sort of career before this was very focused on tech. My background's computer science, math. So I was always very into, very kind of new fields, areas where you get to solve novel problems that hadn't really been solved yet. And so decentralized architectures, distributed algorithms were something that had been getting more and more of my attention. And then a friend of mine came to me in around 2016, a high school friend, and he said, his company was working on this collaboration with MIT Media Lab, which anchors academic records to the Bitcoin blockchain. And would you be interested? And I said, that's a terrible idea. But I learned more and became very interested. And, again, I guess my initial intuition was right in some aspects, but why were we doing that? The problem that we focused on initially was there was a popular what we call badge or digital badge kind of format called open badges, and people used it to express like course completion, or you could use it for a wide range of kind of like course completion kind of skills, certifications, things like that. But the problem was that verification depended on the issuer. So the way that you verified it would be the issuer's website would host that thing. And so basically, if their site went down, if they moved the URL, whatever, you no longer have that accomplishment. So what we were doing with this open badge extension, and by anchoring it to the Bitcoin blockchain, was we were providing a way to have it on a ledger so that anyone could prove that, yes, this is their credential. And of course, over time, we ran into a lot of difficulties with the original approach. Like I think in early on, our focus was very much like, we wanted to draw attention to this problem of, your records, your data, these records that certainly seem like yours, your training, academic accomplishments, all this kind of stuff. Just the idea that you have no way of proving it. And that's something that becomes, it may seem sort of abstract to a lot of people, but if you're coming from a place where, so you're sort of rapidly on the move, you get deplatform cut off, or, all kinds of situations that might happen around the world where you lose the ability to get in touch with the issuer of your credentials. You're cut off from their infrastructure for whatever reason. You lose the ability to claim anything about yourself and what you did. So this started this rabbit hole into decentralized identity. And it was certainly interesting because I do remember we said early on when we started, we don't want to get into identity. It's too complicated. We're focusing on credentials. And yet here I am. It's hard to do anything around claims and credentials without getting into that. But, over time, that's where I found people working on the same problem. And that led me to the verifiable credentials specification. And that was a good sort of, it's a more generic version of an open badge, and it allows you to prove things in different ways. It uses decentralized identifiers, which is a more flexible way of expressing identity. And so then that really became my focus, is making these things real in the world. And I focus on a range of prototypes, use cases. One that I remain most passionate about, though, is certainly what we call lifelong learning, learner worker credentials, so that you can continue to prove these claims about yourself throughout your life.
Very cool. I'm going to ask a question that may be a little bit going down a rabbit tunnel, or if there are rabbit tunnels, maybe I mix metaphors all the time. But anyway, I'm really curious about something you said about the specification, because you're talking about the verifiable claims specification, the standard,
Yeah.
right? And this is just because I don't know this. I've read this the standard a long time ago now, but I didn't think that it actually referenced an implementation using DIDs. Does it?
You're correct. It has no mention of DIDs in the spec. It identifies the issuer and the subject as the data type as a URI, and that can be a DID. It's kind of nice that they separated them out that way. That's the way many people implement it, but it does also mean that it could just be a website. I do want to call out one thing as well. I'm really bad at mixing metaphors too. So I think this is going to be a fantastic conversation of just a cocktail of messy metaphors.
Well, that's fun. That's fun. And of course, we have my puppy over here that's interrupting me, and I notice I keep making some strange faces. So hopefully those will be cut out if they're doing some little snippets of this. Anyway, well, this is really great, and thank you. I couldn't remember. It's been years since I read that, but I know that we're looking at some things with verifiable claims and credentials as well with Holochain, and I didn't think we were using for that work anything in DIDs, and so I was like, wait a minute, did something change?
Right.
That's not the focus of this call. So I want to step back, because I really would love to hear from you. I'd like to get into some definitions and some distinctions a little bit, because the identity space is complex and difficult for a lot of people to understand. So there's four really things that I'd like to sort of unpack a little bit. There's identity, which is very general. There's digital identity, which I think is a little more clear if you already know the first one, maybe. And then there's distributed digital identity. And then, related maybe to some of the projects that you're familiar with, I kind of want to see, how do these differ from or incorporate legal identity, because that comes up a lot in these conversations. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I would love it if we talked about that more, like in this field, for a lot of reasons. Because a lot of harms can happen when you start collapsing all of it. And there are a lot of people who are identity experts who say that none of us should be talking about identity. We should just be making things more precise. And so I'll start by saying, so identity, I think, to your point, it's very large and amorphous, and there's a lot of different possible definitions. I think the working definition that I used to talk about it is, and I was just telling him, I always refer to him, but Joe Andrew has a definition of functional identity, and I would want to look it up to be precise, but the way that you're remembered, recorded, it's a very sort of practical way to think about it and to set it up in the context of digital identity, which the big sort of cause of that initially is we started interacting online. We don't have any way. Hello. we we decided to transact online. How do you share credit card payment information, all this stuff, and starting with the password forms and how that sort of crept up over time. So I think that there's the sort of online digital identity that we use, the fact that the internet wasn't built with one by design. And then, then there's the idea. So self-sovereign identity came along. And I think a lot of the design or the sort of principles for it were happening for many years. And I think Christopher Allen encoded it well in his principles of self-sovereign identity in around 2016. And that really called out the things that we care about that sort of make it more precise around, what are we trying to do here in terms of privacy, ability to control your data, who you share it with. I think, though, some of the early problems with adoption maybe had to do with the reaction that they leaned too much on technology and did not bring in the sort of legal identity aspects. And so I think the few years after that, maybe up till now, have been really heavily focused on reconciling what we mean with these different forms of digital identity, including decentralized digital identity with legal identity. And that's an area where there's a lot of innovation happening around the world, like the EIDAS framework, and especially certainly with national frameworks giving people some form of digital identity that were influenced by these principles, and things like things that have been a long time in the making, with GDPR influencing how people think about their data, and what it means to be able to sort of have consent in these digital interactions, what it means to control your data. And I think some of the initial forms of it, certainly in Switzerland, when they were trying to roll out identities, digital wallets, there was a lot of concern by the citizens that a lot of surveillance and tracking could be done. Like, people didn't want to have large corporations to collect this really robust view of their activities online. And so a lot of the efforts since then have been addressing exactly that. And that's one of the areas where in SSI, has really been pioneering the way, and anti-correlation, and what does it exactly mean to do that. So the thing that's interesting throughout all of this, so like, once things get encoded into technical standards or referenced in legal frameworks, things like that, there can be a sense of, or sometimes I hear people say, okay, so we're done, but what's really interesting is like, no, the way that I think about the principles of what we're trying to do here is inherently something that's going to be ongoing for so many reasons. Technically, the things that we want to even implement are not really solved yet. So like getting improved ability to avoid correlation and zero knowledge proofs, things like that. We're still relatively in the early days. Like, we don't have things moving on to sort of like standards acceptance yet. So not saying that it's premature to use, but just saying, like, for really mainstream adoption, to rely on it, we have to have that. And so it's really messy to accomplish anti-correlation. And the problem of, just more mundane things. If any organization, if you're sharing data, they may be legally applied to store that data, and then someone may be able to go subpoena that data. And so regulations are also very much a part of it. But the other thing that we've learned through EIDAS is like, it is a real art writing these regulations and the frameworks referencing it. Like, I think one of the risks that we've seen is that they want to be very specific in the reference frameworks, and they want to say, okay, do this so that people can know what to do. But it's inherently going to be frozen in time if you're just targeting what you can do right now. Right. So one thing that I think is really key is getting back to the principles and saying, what are the requirements, in a way that then the technical people can go and sort of improve over time. Because I do think that this is, all this tech is still so new, and a lot of the sort of, signature suite, zero knowledge proof, we're still working on. But then lastly, it's just always going to be something that we need to, that no matter what we do, no matter what problems we think we're solving now, there's going to be new issues to deal with. And then a lot of this is, lastly, is really still focused on a federated model of identity in Web 2. And I think that structure is just inherently based on the idea that your data, your identity, all this sort of identity data that you build up over time is siloed into different companies, and there's all these different opportunities for them to monetize it. And whether it's Web 3, Web 5, that flip is the real innovation that helps prevent that, and also from a sort of convenience perspective, lets you reuse your reputation, your credentials, all this kind of stuff. So sorry, that was a long meandering answer. But you've touched on a few things I've been thinking about, because I get the question a lot, like, okay, decentralized identity standards are being adopted. Are we done? And so what does decentralized identity standards even mean? And what does done mean, et cetera?
Right. Well, just to kind of backtrack for a minute, because you were referencing what I think is the European digital identity architecture and reference framework.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
it does seem like a lot of the policy and a lot of push towards a standard is really coming in Europe, where, like you said, there's the digital wallet initiative as well. And I think the pushback is also present in Europe because of that, because a couple of things that I just want to reflect on maybe a bit out of what you said, because it was quite fascinating. One is that in the current instantiation of Web3, it seems more correlatable, if that's a word.
Yes. Yes.
Not less, because if what the baseline is of identity is a wallet, like as in a crypto wallet, it's public usually. And to then think that a bunch of other things would be easily placed onto that, certificates, credentials, whatever you want to call it, that starts getting a little frightening, I would say, because it, like you said, there has been at least a seeming of separation of some of what is your identity out there. I know we all know that that's not real. We all know that there are data brokers that combine everything and try to mix it up and try to sell their knowledge to somebody else so they can make a buck off of everybody. But you at least have this sense of like, well, you didn't put it in all these places. And I think when I listen to what people on the street, and when I say that, I really probably mean conferences, are saying, they would like more nuance. They would like more ability to say, well, if I'm on a social media platform or if I'm sharing a blog post that's personal versus a blog post that's on my business site, I want those things separate in some way. I don't want everybody to be able to put all the parts of me together and then decide things that may or may not be true. And besides that, make up a whole bunch of other things, like you say, correlate the rest of what it is. And for all different reasons. For some people, it's because you have issues or concerns with even like the state and the government that you're living under. And other places you have concerns about companies and what they're going to try to influence you about, whatever it might be. They're real though. They're valid concerns. What's really interesting is I love that you talk about the evolution of it and the continued work that's necessary. I heard something in how you shared it that was new for me, which was cool. It reminded me back in the early days of the internet, when we were first starting to figure out online payments, and everybody did it poorly, right? Everybody had so many websites that did it insecure and all these other things, right? And you learn little bits at a time. But one of the things we thought at first was, oh, good, at least there's this one payment place. If I just give my information to PayPal, maybe that will make it safer, because then I don't have to share my credit card details and all these other things about myself with all these other websites. But at the end of the day, the correlation work that's there meant that you were sharing it with everybody anyway. They just might not have the credit card detail right then and there.
Right.
Does that sound like a reasonable interpretation?
Yeah, that's true. They can build up a rich history of, and certainly through the data brokers of what you've been doing online. And there's a couple of things that, I agree with your sort of characterization as well in terms of how Web3, a lot of activities in Web3, and just the fact that things are currently associated more to, like, say, wallet addresses and the increased correlatability. And that's, I think, where there's increasing awareness of decentralized identity. Like, the thing that was interesting and what sort of drew me to that community was like the enthusiasm and the clear desire to do a lot of the same things that we're doing in different ways. And I think, like, one thing that was frustrating for me when I started out with some Web3 kind of projects was like, it was just hard to compete with the convenience of the Web3 tool sets and everything. And it was clear that we had a lot of work to do to avoid all of those, so like when soulbound tokens came out, like were really proposed, and basically the sort of, well, the token based model and the idea of the increased correlatability, there were, both communities were kind of talking past each other. And certainly from people who thought about this for like 20 years about the risks of having your activities on chain, than to hear people tout them as a benefit. Like, so one that I heard that Vitalik himself, I think, said was like, you could use, if criminal convictions were recorded on a blockchain, you could use lack of that as it was something around maybe negative reputation. It was just something that we're like, like makes us just crazy. And so I think a lot of the early discussions were maybe talking past each other. But I saw it from the perspective of, I think that it's a challenge for decentralized identity. It's on us to stop talking past each other and make it easier, make it more easy to integrate into what people are doing. And it's a combination of things. Like, it's the fact that we're, it's inherently off-chain, cross-chain, what we're trying to do. And so that's sort of more how we connect with the sort of, like, you can go from Web3 to Web2, and sort of how do you get the credentials in the wallets? How do you get all the interesting wallet providers to support them without requiring people to install a new wallet, and all of those usability concerns, in terms of what's supported in different, sort of blockchain stacks. There are also new opportunities coming up with ZKPs and everything. So I think those are kind of evolving as well. But the main thing that stood out is that, if we started just having more conversations and working together, like, this is a really great opportunity for alignment, and also just the inherent nature for decentralized identity to address these, like, cross-chain sort of issues. There's one other thing that you mentioned, and that's something that comes up when, I try to talk about briefly. So, like, say that you have the ability to share verifiable credentials, but still in a sort of federated Web2 kind of model. What am I still missing there? And I think that the big thing is that we are still accustomed to this model where we share all our data for purposes of someone vetting us, but we're not afforded that in return. And so we get the browser check mark, for example, to give us some assurance of we're on a certain site or whatever. But the risks always come from everything else, the text messages that you get, and is it really from Wells Fargo, or, all of these things. And one of our new members at DIF is focusing on the impact specifically to, senior citizens, and, like if they can confuse, people who work daily in technology, like, my God, they're getting really good at deceiving us with, just all these forms of, the sort of the out of band kind of initial contacts that can trick you into joining. And this gets worse, of course, with deep fakes and, the ability to simulate someone else's voice. So this mutual authentication part is the part that I think is still missing and is needed to really restore trust. And that's where I'm really excited of how decentralized identity, the problems that we're trying to solve.
That's really interesting. I know, sometimes for me, it's helpful to, instead of referencing a Web 2 solution and then tacking on distributed, and and I know that things happen in a variety of different ways on Web 2. It's not all perfectly centralized. I don't mean to just contrast that aspect of it, but still the technological solutioning that goes into Web 2 versus Web 3 sometimes doesn't help as the starting point. And so it's actually better to go back to completely low tech, and go, how might we have done this before the internet?
Yes.
What would we have done in person? Then what would we have done at a slightly longer distance when maybe we use telephones or mail or other things? Because there's a lot to learn in the way that problems were solved at different levels of technology. And if we only go back one level of technology, we make a lot of bad assumptions. We're not even opening up the field for the exploration fully. So I think that's at least that's one of the things I like to consider from a design perspective in distributed applications. And it sounds like that's a lot what you guys are kind of saying. We need to go wider. We need to be a little bit more exploratory in how we come at this.
I would love to have some kind of, retreat focused on just that. So the framing of it as, expectations of privacy as we moved online compared to, in-person interactions, that's key. And the contextual integrity model is one that I like a lot in terms of, there's these, I think there are sort of 5 factors in terms of like how the medium for communication, what's the message, who, which parties, there are all these factors. And I think to really, I agree that if you have as a starting point today's solutions, you may miss a lot of kind of requirements, desires, or new possibilities are enabled by this, but you want to think about it in a more structured way. So I think that I like that framing of it. There was one other thing I was thinking. So at the recent Internet Identity Workshop, Wendy Seltzer, she is in W3C, and she led a session on enshittification, which is Cory Doctorow. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but his term,
I think.
yeah, we'll find out later. And so enshittification, and the way I think of it is just this like, dread-inducing, mundane thing that we're encountering increasingly in our lives, where to use this product that I purchase, I have to use the replacement cartridges from that vendor. And it's just like this form of just eking out the last, last pennies that you can from people. Right. And then
capture.
Yeah, capture, and, just in our products, in our online lives. And I think that it's amazing that if you have that in your mind, and then go browse the web, and then you're aware of like how you're just encountering friction at every point, and then also thinking what it could be like. So enshittification has been very much on my mind lately, and in that session was interesting. We came up with a few ways of thinking about it. Like basically a lot of it was only an hour. So for the most part, we were just crying. No, I'm just kidding. We were just, but so there was a evolutionary biologist who was thinking about it from a systems perspective. And there was a term that you used, like I had proposed that we should think about it from a counterfactual perspective as well. Like how could we have made it worse? How could we have made it better? I think there's a lot of thought exercises that we could really benefit from in terms of how we design these, from scratch, from what the user sees. And I think, again, like I definitely don't want to imply I'm wanting to tear down everything. It's very important, and Decentralized Identity Foundation is very keen to sort of bridge and sort of, whatever, start where you are, start using these improvements. Right. But I think that it's also a good time for people to sort of rethink how we want things to work.
What is the primary objective or goal of the foundation? And I know you work in a lot of different roles and a lot of different other organizations as well, so I'm really curious about the Distributed Identity Foundation objectives, but then I'm also curious about how some of the ways that you're working in other organizations kind of express what you're trying to achieve in these areas.
Yeah, so DIF's charter is building the foundational components of open, standards-based, and then this is self-referencing decentralized identity ecosystem. And then we say for people, organizations, and apps and devices, right? So the decentralized identity model is great because in very adaptable to the kind of systems and risks that we're increasingly seeing now, gives you the opportunity to say, give identities to devices, to AI agents, establish these chains of trust. Right. And then, so we have to get into a little bit more how DIF works. We've historically focused on these sort of 3 phases of a life cycle. So the first 2 would be incubate and graduate. So incubating, we really excel at sort of these brand new ideas that people are thinking, like, how do we do this? How do we get a set of people to agree with each other and build components that talk to each other? And so those typically end up being draft specifications. In the incubation side, we also have use case incubation. So we have special interest groups that meet and talk about maybe regional considerations or considerations related to a sector like travel and hospitality or finance. And graduate, that's been that, we really do like to focus on incubation. Standards can mature and spec, but we're also really happy if they graduate out. And they've, we've had examples of DIDCOM being contributed to IETF and contributing to other standards organizations. The third one that kind of completes the cycle that we're really focusing on this year is we're calling it for now apply and grow. And that has to do with completing things back, because basically like the incubation, so we incubate and then we end up getting a standard, but then that brings up all these new kinds of considerations in terms of how it applies. And so this year, or actually in the next couple of months, we'll be rolling out what we call a labs working group structure, which is a more lightweight way for people to participate, try out entirely new protocols and standards, but then also develop things based on it, whether it's interoperability, best practices, reports, like all of these sort of frictions that people are finding for getting adoption, establishing interoperability, things like that. The other area of that is that we noticed that a lot of times when people ask, like, where's the adoption of SSI, the answer is just right in front of our face. And I noticed this when I joined, because I started attending, or when I joined as executive director, I started attending groups that I had not in the past, like the travel and hospitality, the IoT. And what was really interesting is that was where we had the people coming with great use cases, but because the experts were there and the technology people didn't know to go there, we weren't really connecting. And so meanwhile, the technology people who maybe like CTOs for startups were saying, oh, I don't know where to find the customers. And so I realized, oh, you guys just need to talk to each other. And so that's one area that we're really focusing on amplifying, so that we can, connect internally and then externally. And through our partnerships, we're trying to bring a much larger platform to that. So for example, we've partnered with Cuppinger Coles. So we're really interested to work with analysts to, expose them to what's happening, why people are finding value in adoption. And so, yeah, that's sort of the phase that we're rolling out this year.
Fabulous. Cool. You were talking a little bit earlier about some of the sort of challenges or some of the hard problems really that are in the area of distributed digital identity that just haven't been solved yet. Or maybe some of them we're not even sure can be solved, right? I mean, this is the question sometimes with when you're on cutting edge or innovation edges. Can you share a little bit about those in more detail?
Yeah, I think that some of the big ones really have to do with the idea that the model is just completely different. So it's cryptography based, and we want to provide people, you know, I think early on we maybe started too much with the idea of, well, similar to Web3, like write down your mnemonic seed and so like it's bad OPSEC to say this, but like, anyone else is like me, mine is stored in some Hello Kitty notepad that I have. It's like, which Hello Kitty notepad is it in? And I don't know. So, yeah, so people aren't going to do that. They're bad at managing mnemonic seeds. So how do you bring in more modern, convenient, and to be clear, like passwords just suck no matter what. And so, like there's different methods of authentication that are better. And so bringing in these, that's something that is sort of starting to roll out now into more of the mainstream with passkey and everything. So that solves some aspect of identification that we can bring into decentralized identity authentication methods as well. It doesn't solve everything, but so it's like the integrating convenient forms of proof of control or association authentication that people are not overly heavy lifts for people. The other thing has to do with the idea of what is the natural home for people, and this is where I feel like this is the new category. And so certainly with the European wallet work, that's big forcing function for that to happen. What people have tried to call that different things in SSI. So, wallet, backpack, pocket is actually one thing that I'm working on as well. But so the idea that if you're going to put someone in control of their data, you need this point for them to access, to conveniently manage. You don't want it to, cause the proliferation of more and more wallets. Walking that tightrope of, so like, okay, does that mean that the major, who's going to end up controlling the wallet? And, so you want to make sure that whatever is being done is standards based all the way, has, possibility to, or transparency in what's happening, flexibility, portability. Then there's all the, so more and more work is happening in terms of that. A lot of it comes from the EU regulations. There's Open Wallet Foundation that's working very heavily on that. It's got a lot of those sort of like immediate answers. Then the next one that I feel like I haven't seen enough work on yet, and I want to see more of, is okay, then when, okay, you don't want to bombard people with too many consent options, right? So you don't want them to have to manually navigate and pick, and it's just a lot to manage the more and more credentials you add. So the sort of conveniences and norms around how you display that to a user. I know there's sort of fragmented work, but that's something that we can do a lot more work on to make sure that it's displayed in a consistent way, in a way that people's eyes are drawn to exactly what they need to. Then also, with the focus on the wallet, there needs to also be focus on, more the agents or the endpoint, which could be like, a wallet implies that you're sort of taking an action, right? But there may be one of the really novel aspects of decentralized identity is the idea of this, again, this mutual authentication. And so perhaps there's something like, say you have a decentralized storage behind that, and you want to say, like, maybe some data that you control, you're okay sharing, you consider that part of your public data. You don't want every request coming to you as this sort of like sign off consent. So there's all of those kind of really practical details around managing that. I think the ongoing thing will certainly be making sure that we have standards and transparency for every aspect of the wallet. It will be natural that there will be if a major tech vendor comes out with their wallet already installed, if they support, like, say, the architecture, the EIDAS wallet, I think that's going to be a huge draw. But then we want to make sure, like, okay, so we do want to we want to understand what's happening there. We want to make sure people have visibility into what's happening and have choices. Those are the kinds of things that are, the also very practical considerations. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought once again.
I mean, there's a lot going on. It's
Yeah.
easy to understand why. I noticed that for me, as you talk about the work that's happening, the forcing factors that are kind of behind some of the work, it actually has it has more concern actually be there in some ways, right? There's pieces of what you're describing that sound critical for end users, that sound critical for us to get an experience that we're looking for. The kind of point of bringing agency into this whole realm is what the distributed side of it is. At least for me, that's kind of how I look at it, right? That it starts with being able to have a sense of what it is that I share, like you said at the beginning, what it is that I share, what it is that I don't share, and in what ways, and not having it be just one massive, this is everything that you could ever possibly need to know about Mary, her bank records, her, what clubs she's belonged to, what her clothing, what clothes are in her closet, what dogs and everything else, that I could like make a list of, which a lot of those I share quite publicly, but there's plenty of things that I don't. And there's different ways and nuances that I want to show up in different places, right? Even, let's just take, I'm going to take it out of the realm of wallets from the perspective, at least, of money for a moment, because that's one of the difficulties of separating right now. We're using the term wallet in the realm of identity, but really we mean what, private keys, private key pairs. We're really talking about key management at a level, and in some ways to call it a wallet is a misnomer, because public-private key pairs have existed forever, well, for a long time, and we've been using them in software for a long, long time. They've just been under the hood. And what happens is when you try to have the control move out to the edge to the people, it becomes a little more important that they understand that they have this thing that they need to be responsible for and to manage. And the thing is it's true no matter if they're just being responsible for the ones that give them access to the chat application that they're using, or the social network that they're using, or the game that they're playing over here. I mean, like, there's all these different ways that, like I said, we show up. And sometimes we show up in places that are groups, and sometimes we're showing up one-to-one, or sometimes it's service, individual to business, all of these different contexts, like you were just talking about earlier. And I think when I hear about the wallet and the forcing factors that are bringing this consistency down to a wallet is a public-private key pair. It's not sufficient, in
Yeah.
my view, to constitute identity. And it's a little frightening. That's the part that gets frightening, because I want to be able to see more ways for people to have an authentic self show up, that can have credentials, that can have reputation. But the reality is that the reputation of my game playing is not significant to some people in my community, but it's very significant to others. And it's not to say that that doesn't have money on the line, because it might.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's just that it may not have anything to do with the certificate that I just got in my professional career, track over here, which
Yeah.
somebody else needs to know about. And I wouldn't want those necessarily correlated. So we're back to
Yeah.
what you brought up at the beginning, which is how do you really deal with these algorithms that you were talking about? I don't know that I've heard a lot about that. I mean, obviously, I have heard quite a bit about the oh, I just went blank.
My I'm infectious with that.
Oh, okay, so it's the technology that's used for keeping something private but getting a verification anyway.
Yeah, and I think, I think this is why
PK
it's
proof.
interesting. I think this is why I started trailing off, because the big, so I caught myself in a rabbit hole talking about wallets. To step back, if we're not even sure that's the right term or concept, there is a risk in labeling it and saying, okay, we're done, we're doing this, right? And I think that this touches on the other aspects you were mentioning, which is like, okay, the IDIS, the work in Europe, and it's, again, great work, like very exciting because pushing this forward. But the use cases are like capital I identity, so your national identity and all of this. And I think, and it's great that a lot of progress is being made on that. Like there's all kinds of like levels of assurance, alignments that need to be figured out, security. The risk is that we've missed like the broader conversation. Certainly, I see that a lot of the use cases that, a lot of the original focuses from early on, which, with national identity, there's authoritative issue, like it's going to be the government, right?
Right.
The whole point was that
We
we
don't need it
wanted to
distributed.
exactly. The whole point is we wanted to allow a broader range of signals, to allow people to establish reputation and, and then even like so it doesn't have to be these digital national identity cards. It can be something like equivalent to a recommendation. It could be proof of reliable payment history, which may lead to alternate, credit score kind of
Right.
signals. So I think it's like, for me, the thing that I want us to continue to focus on is all of these other use cases
Yeah.
that are a critical part of what the goals are. And so, for example, a lot of my work in the ASU Trusted Learner Network really allows me to be a day-to-day, or at least week to week, sort of focused on making sure we're making progress in some of those. And because some of the claims that we're focusing on are really focused on frontline workers and certifications that might be issued just by their employer, but ones that another one would accept. And so I think these are the kind of use cases that excite me a lot, in terms of like, there's clear new applications, conveniences, job, economic mobility that can be enabled. And I want to see a lot more of that. So I think that's what I'm
Yeah.
really excited about.
That's really great. I love hearing about that. It rhymes quite a bit with I interviewed Lohan Spies. He's working on some DID projects down in South Africa. And what I loved about his sharing, especially, was that it brought a different context of what are the situations and the use cases in a part of the world where we're not doing the Internet Identity Workshop, right?
Yes.
Because there's so many people in other places where the challenges that bring that technology brings are different,
Right.
right? The technologies that are being used may be different, or how they're being used or is different. And so really understanding those use cases and trying to solve the problems that people have on the ground, that's where the magic is, right? That's where the juice is. And I really appreciated hearing more of that, because we can't all be aware of what's going on everywhere. That's a fundamental, right? And one of the things I love about chatting with you is you have such a breadth of background, especially dealing with all the different groups, it seems, that are working at standardizing. Well, standardizing is a long-term process that involves a lot of people. And so it inherently means that, like, that you're gathering from many. And it's a pleasure to kind of hear the thoughts that go into all of that, not the perfection, but
Thank you.
that there's a lot there. So I want to
Thank
ask
you.
one last question, because I know we're at the end of our time together, and this is just one of my crazy questions. So you could just do what you will with it. This is sort of like, if you could just wave a magic wand and make some change in this field, what would it be?
Good question. What would be that one thing? I I know what it would be. I feel like many when I talk about, yes, we're making progress, but oh, it's not good enough. You know, where every time this has happened, it has to do with the idea that, we say that we want broad range of input on the specifications we're writing, but how are people going to give any input into those, right? So like there's just the aspect of translating what's happening and then backing those up into requirements, use cases. And I still feel like we put those off to the very end. They're an afterthought. And, I think that in order to get the broad input and sort of participation that we need to continue to keep pushing for more of that. So I think the magic wand thing would be just sort of everyone realizes that that's important, and we don't run off in our technical silos and build specs and say we're done, right? Because it's just not how it works in my head for what we're trying to accomplish. So, but I guess we can continue to keep pushing on that and doing better at communicating.
No, that's fabulous. That actually gives me a lot of hope. So thank you. Because the way, Holochain has been operating has just been, hey, we're going to build something, and we have these use cases in mind that we're building it for, and we've been very lightly involved with specifications, and it's more that it moves at a different pace. It comes at it with in a different modality, and yet what you just described means that there's still opportunity to contribute.
Oh,
And
there is,
I'm
yes.
really
Reach
excited
out
about
anytime to
that.
anyone. Yes, open invitation.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. It was such a pleasure to have you on the show, and look forward to talking more about digital identity.
Thank you too. It was great talking to you as always. And yes.